You ever get arrested for touching something that legally belongs to you? The heat hit me first, that dry Texas kind that sticks to your skin like dust, followed by the sudden silence where the pump used to hum. The water stopped mid-cycle, just like I intended, and for a second, the entire ranch felt like it was holding its breath. I stood there inside the pump house, hands still resting on the old steel valve wheel, warm from the sun, listening to the ticking metal as the pressure dropped through lines my father laid down 42 years ago. Then came the sound. That didn't belong. Tires crunching too fast over gravel, a car door slamming, heels hitting dirt like someone marching into a courtroom they thought they owned. I didn't even have to look to know it was Brenda Whitmore. Her voice cut through the air before I stepped outside, sharp, loud, already halfway into performance mode. Yes, he shut off the water. He's endangering the entire community. I want an officer here now. And just like that, she had 911 on speaker, pacing at my front gate like she was narrating a crime scene. I pushed the door open slow, the smell of oil, rust, and sunbaked wood following me out, and there she was, standing just outside the fence line. Perfectly pressed blouse, oversized sunglasses, one hand on her hip, the other gripping her phone like it was a badge. Behind her, two of her HOA neighbors lingered near the road, watching like they'd been invited to a show. "Ethan," she said, lowering the phone just enough to talk directly at me, not to me. "You don't get to just shut off community utilities whenever you feel like it." And I could hear it in her tone, that quiet certainty, the kind that comes from never being told no. I leaned one shoulder against the gatepost, dust settling around my boots, and just looked at her for a second, really looked, because people like Brenda always tell you exactly who they are if you give them enough time to talk. Community utilities, I repeated, more to myself than to her, tasting the words like something that didn't belong on this land. The valve key was still in my back pocket, pressing against my hip, and somewhere behind me, the empty pipes clicked softly as the last of the water drained down. "You've got families out here," she kept going, voice rising now that she had an audience. "Kids, livestock, people relying on that water, and you just decided to play cowboy and shut it off." She turned slightly, angling her phone toward me again, making sure dispatch could hear every word. "He's refusing to restore service. He's being confrontational." And I almost smiled at that, because I hadn't raised my voice once. The wind shifted, carrying the faint metallic scent of the pump and the dry grass stretching out behind the house. And in that moment, I realized she actually believed this, believed that if she said it loud enough, long enough, it would become true. I stepped closer to the gate, close enough to see the reflection of the ranch in her sunglasses, my land, my fence, my pump house sitting just over her shoulder like a detail she'd decided didn't matter. "Brenda," I said, calm, steady, the way my dad used to when he was about to explain something that didn't need explaining. "You called the police on me for shutting off my own water," and she didn't hesitate, not even for a second. "Yes," she snapped, chin lifting slightly, "because you don't get to control what this community depends on." And that was it right there, the line she crossed without even realizing it. The moment she said out loud what she'd been acting on for months. In the distance, faint at first, then building, I heard the siren, low and steady, rolling across the open land toward us, and Brenda's posture shifted just a fraction, like backup had already validated her. I slipped my hand into my pocket, feeling the edges of folded paperwork I'd carried longer than she'd been president of anything, and watched her stand there, waiting to have me arrested on my own ranch, for a system she didn't own, connected to a line she never had the right to touch. And I let the silence stretch just long enough for her to think she'd already won. I bought this place when Austin was still an hour away and not creeping closer every year, when you could stand out here at sunrise and hear nothing but wind moving through cedar and the low rattle of pipes warming up for the day. And my father used to say that water was the only thing on this land that people would fight over before they even knew why. The pump house behind me was not much to look at, just weathered boards, a corrugated roof that popped in the heat, and a lockbox bolted to the side where the main valve key stayed. But every inch of that system had a purpose, every line measured, every joint sealed by hand. And I knew it the way some people know their own handwriting. When I was 12, he walked me through the whole layout with a grease pencil and a folded survey map, tracing the main line from the well to the holding tank. then out along the eastern fence where the pipe dipped under the ground and ran straight toward what used to be open pasture and was now a cluster of identical rooftops and trimmed lawns pretending to be something they were not. "They will come for this," he told me back then, tapping the paper right where the line crossed the boundary. "Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day somebody is going to stand on the other side of that fence and act like this belongs to them." And I remember laughing because at 12 years old you think land stays the way you see it. I remember the smell of sun-warmed dust and the way the metal valve squeaked when he turned it, slow and steady, never forcing it, always respecting the pressure behind it. After he passed, I kept everything the same schedule, same maintenance, same quiet respect for how much work it took to keep water moving across ground that did not want to give it up easily. Then the subdivision showed up, first with survey stakes, then with trucks, then with signs that used words like community and development like they meant something out here, and I watched them build right up to the edge of my fence like the line was just a suggestion. At first, it was small things, a contractor asking if they could tap into the line temporarily, a promise that it would only be for a few weeks, that permits were coming, that everything would be squared away, and I said yes once because that is what people do when they think the other side is acting in good faith. Weeks turned into months, and months turned into something that looked a lot like permanent. And by the time Brenda Whitmore started showing up with her clipboard and her rules, the narrative had already shifted in her head, not from owner to neighbor, but from owner to obstacle. She never asked where the water came from, never checked the county records, never walked the line with someone who knew what they were looking at. She just saw green lawns on her side and assumed the source belonged to the same idea of control she carried around like it was law. The first time she mentioned shared resources, I knew exactly where this was heading, because people who use that phrase usually mean something they did not pay for, something they did not build, something they plan to keep using until someone stops them. And standing there now, with the siren getting closer and the pipes behind me settling into silence, I could almost hear my father's voice again. Not loud, not dramatic, just certain, like he had already seen this exact moment play out. Years before it ever happened, and all I had done was finally turn the handle he told me one day I would have to. Brenda Whitmore did not show up one day and suddenly decide the water belonged to her. She grew into that belief the way mold grows in the dark, quietly, steadily, feeding off small moments where nobody pushed back hard enough. The first time she stepped onto my side of the fence, she did it with a smile and a clipboard, heels sinking just slightly into the dirt like the ground itself was reminding her she did not belong there. But she acted like she did not notice. "We are doing a routine infrastructure review," she said, not asking for permission, just announcing it like a fact that existed whether I agreed or not. And I remember standing there with a wrench in my hand, the faint smell of oil and hot metal rising off the pump housing, watching her trace the line of the pipe with her pen, without ever once looking at the survey markers driven into the soil. I told her then, calm and clear, that the line she was pointing at ran through private agricultural land, that it was not part of any subdivision plan, not listed under any shared utility agreement, and not something her homeowners association had any authority over. She smiled at that, the kind of smile that does not change the eyes, and flipped a page in her binder like she had already decided which version of reality she preferred. "Everything that services the community falls under community standards," she said, tapping the paper as if ink could override steel and dirt and decades of recorded ownership. After that, the visits became more frequent. Never direct confrontations, just little adjustments. A contractor truck parked too close to the fence line, a crew walking the path of the pipe without calling ahead, a new lock on the outer gate one morning that did not match the one I had installed the week before. I cut that lock off and replaced it, left a note, kept it simple, but the message did not land because she was not operating on permission, she was operating on assumption. Then came the letters, official-looking envelopes with bold headers and sections highlighted in yellow, citing violations that did not apply to land outside her jurisdiction, fines that had no legal footing, and deadlines that meant nothing beyond the pressure she hoped they would create. I filed every one of them in a metal drawer inside the pump house, each envelope sliding in with a soft scrape that sounded more like evidence than paperwork. The day she brought up community water access fees was the day I realized this was not confusion anymore. This was a system she was building, charging her residents for something she did not own, presenting it like a benefit she controlled, and counting on the fact that nobody would walk the line far enough to see where it actually started. I gave her written notice after that, certified, signed, documented, stating clearly that any use of the water line without a formal easement agreement was unauthorized and had to stop until proper terms were established. She never responded directly, not in writing, not in a way that could be held up later, but the behavior did not stop. It just got quieter, more deliberate, like someone who knows they are stepping over a boundary and decides to do it anyway as long as nobody is watching. And now, standing at my gate with a phone in her hand and a siren closing the distance behind her, she was finally saying it out loud, finally putting her version of ownership into the open where it could not be taken back or reworded. And I knew right then that everything she had done up to this moment was about to matter a whole lot more than she thought. The patrol car rolled in slow, tires crunching over gravel like it was testing the ground before committing, and the red and blue lights washed across the fence posts, across Brenda's polished sunglasses, across the faded wood of the pump house behind me, turning everything into something sharper than it had been a minute ago. The engine idled low, steady, and when the driver door opened, Deputy Mason Reed stepped out with the kind of calm that comes from seeing the same kind of call dressed up in 100 different ways. He took in the scene in one sweep: the gate, Brenda pacing just inside the road, the two neighbors pretending not to stare, and me standing still with dust on my boots and my hands empty. "Afternoon," he said, voice even, not picking a side yet, just placing himself in the middle of it. Brenda moved first, quick, eager, stepping toward him before he even reached the gate, her voice already loaded with urgency. "Officer, thank God you are here." He shut off the water. "To the entire community, people cannot even run their faucets. This is dangerous. This is unacceptable." And she gestured toward me like I was a problem that needed to be handled, not a person standing on his own land. Reed nodded once, listening, eyes shifting to me for a second, then back to her, letting her finish, letting her build it the way she wanted it built. "He is refusing to turn it back on," she added, lowering her voice just enough to sound controlled. "And I believe this qualifies as interference with essential services." And there it was, the phrase she had been waiting to use, something that sounded official enough to carry weight if nobody questioned where it came from. Reed glanced at the dry line running along the fence, then back at me. "Sir, is that accurate? Did you shut off the water?" And I nodded once, not defensive, not rushed, just answering the question that was actually asked. "Yes, I did." And I could feel Brenda's posture tighten beside him like that. Confirmation was all she needed. "See," she said, almost relieved. "He admits it." And for a second the air felt thinner, like the heat had pressed everything into a single moment where this could go one of two ways depending on what got said next. Reed shifted his weight slightly, one hand resting near his belt, not aggressive, just grounded. "Can you tell me why?" he asked, and I could hear the difference in how he asked it. Not assuming, just opening the door. I reached into my back pocket slow, careful, pulling out the folded papers that had been riding there since before the siren started, the edges worn from being handled more than once, and I held them loosely at my side without opening them yet. "Because it is my system," I said, steady, watching Brenda out of the corner of my eye as the words landed. "And it was being used without authorization." And that word hung there for a second, heavier than anything she had said so far. Brenda let out a short laugh, sharp, dismissive. "That is not how this works," she said, turning slightly toward Reed again. "This line services the neighborhood. It is part of our community infrastructure. He cannot just decide to shut it down." And she said it like she had said it 100 times before, like repetition had turned it into truth. Reed looked between us, then back at me. "Do you have documentation for that?" he asked, and this time I did open the papers, unfolding them against the hood of his patrol car, the metal warm under my hands, the map spreading out, with its lines and markings, the boundary clearly drawn where the pipe crossed from my land toward hers. The wind caught one corner and lifted it slightly, and I pressed it down with my palm, feeling the grit of dust against the page. "Everything you need is right here," I said, not louder, not sharper, just certain. And for the first time since she picked up that phone, Brenda did not speak right away. Reed leaned in slightly over the hood, one hand resting near the edge of the paper as his eyes traced the lines, slow, methodical, the way someone reads when they know the details matter more than the noise around them. And for a few seconds the only sound was the low hum of the patrol car engine and the faint click of cooling metal from the pump house behind me. Brenda shifted beside him, just a step too close, trying to angle herself into his line of sight. "Those maps can say anything," she said, brushing a strand of hair back with a quick, controlled motion. "What matters is how the system is actually being used, and right now it is serving the entire neighborhood." And she said it like usage alone created ownership, like repetition had rewritten the rules in her favor. Reed did not look up right away, just followed the boundary line on the survey with his finger, from the wellhead marked on my side all the way to where the pipe crossed under the fence and continued into her development. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more focused. "This line originates here," he said, more to confirm than to ask, and I nodded once. "It was installed in 1981, permitted under agricultural use, maintained privately ever since," I said, keeping it simple, letting the facts sit where they landed. Brenda let out a small breath that sounded like impatience dressed up as confidence. "Again, that does not change the fact that it is now part of our community infrastructure," she pressed, tapping the edge of the hood lightly, as if she could punctuate the argument into place. "We have residents depending on it. We have collected fees for maintenance. We have." She stopped just short of finishing that sentence, and that was the first crack, small but clear, the kind you only notice if you are listening for it. Reed's eyes lifted from the map to her, just a fraction, enough to catch that hesitation. "You have collected fees?" he asked, not accusing, just repeating her words back to her, and I could see the shift happen in real time. The way her posture adjusted, shoulders tightening, chin lifting a little higher as she recalibrated. "Standard community dues," she corrected quickly, smoothing it over, "allocated toward shared services." But the phrasing had already changed, already softened, already stepped back from what she almost said. I slid another sheet out from the fold, this one thicker, stamped, the kind of document that carries weight before you even read it, and placed it next to the map. "That line has no recorded easement," I said, tapping the section where the county seal sat in faded blue ink. "No transfer of rights, no shared access agreement, nothing filed that gives the HOA any legal claim to it." And I did not raise my voice, did not push the words harder than they needed to be pushed, because paper like that does not need volume to be heard. The wind shifted again, lifting a bit of dust off the road, and for a moment it moved between us, soft, almost quiet, settling along the edge of the documents like it belonged there. Reed straightened slightly, looking from the map to the stamped page, then back toward the line of houses beyond the fence. Rows of identical rooftops sitting just far enough away to pretend they were separate from what fed them. "Ma'am," he said, turning back to Brenda, the tone still calm, but carrying something firmer now. "Do you have any documentation that shows the association has legal access to this water source?" And this time, there was no immediate answer, no quick correction, no confident pivot, just a brief pause where the certainty that had been filling the air since she arrived seemed to thin out, like pressure leaking from a system that had finally been shut off. Brenda did not answer right away, and that silence stretched just long enough to feel unfamiliar on her, like she had stepped onto ground that did not respond the way she expected. She shifted her weight, one heel grinding lightly into the gravel, then lifted her chin again as if posture alone could restore control. "We do not need a separate document for something that has been functioning this way for years," she said, slower now, choosing each word like she was trying to build a bridge back to certainty. "The community relies on it. That establishes practical use." And there it was again, that same logic, repetition over record, assumption over ownership. Reed did not interrupt her, but his eyes did not leave her face this time, and when she finished, he let a small pause sit between them before speaking. "Practical use does not override recorded property rights," he said, not harsh, not confrontational, just stating it the way you state something that does not change depending on who is listening. I slid one more sheet across the hood, thinner, but marked with dates and signatures, copies of the certified notices I had sent over the past 6 months, each one outlining the same thing in clear language, that the line was private, that continued use required formal agreement, that unauthorized access would result in termination of service, and I tapped the top page lightly. These were delivered and signed for, I said, and the paper made a soft, dry sound under my finger that seemed louder than it should have been. Brenda's eyes flicked down to the dates, then back up, and for the first time since. She stepped out of her car. There was a flicker of something that was not confidence, not quite worry, but something close enough to it. Those were under review, she said quickly, almost too quickly. We were in the process of addressing them. And I could hear the shift again, from certainty to explanation, from authority to defense. Reed picked up the top notice, scanning the header, then the signature line. And I watched his expression settle into something more defined, the kind of look that comes when a situation stops being unclear. You were notified that continued use without an agreement would result in service interruption, he said, more to confirm the sequence than to ask, and I nodded. Multiple times. I answered. Brenda stepped forward half a pace, her voice tightening. This is not how a community operates, she said, the words sharper now. You do not just cut people off. There are procedures. There are responsibilities. And I almost nodded at that, because she was right about one thing. There were procedures, just not the ones she had been following. There are, I said, meeting her gaze directly now. And they start with having the legal right to use something before you build a system around it. And the wind moved through again, lighter this time, carrying the dry scent of grass and sun-baked wood. And for a moment the entire scene felt like it had slowed down, like everything that had been building over the past months had finally reached a point where it could not be pushed any further without breaking. Reed set the notice back down carefully, aligning it with the map like he was putting the pieces together in a way that could not be taken apart, then looked at Brenda again, not unkind, but no longer neutral. Ma'am, based on what I am seeing here, this appears to be a private system with no recorded access granted to the association, he said, and the words landed clean, without emphasis, without decoration, just facts arranged in the only order they could exist in. Brenda opened her mouth to respond, then stopped, just for a second, and in that second, the entire structure she had been standing on since she arrived seemed to shift beneath her, not collapsing yet, but no longer as solid as it had felt when she first picked up that phone. The air shifted again, not with wind this time, but with something quieter, heavier, like the moment right before a pressure gauge finally settles into its true reading, and I could see it in the way Brenda's shoulders held tension that was not there before, in the way her fingers tightened around her phone without realizing it. She tried to recover, stepping forward just enough to reclaim space. This is not over, she said, voice firm but thinner now. You cannot just disrupt an entire neighborhood because of a technicality. And that word landed wrong, because nothing about what she had built her argument on was technical. It was fundamental, it was ownership, it was record, it was the difference between using something and having the right to it. Reed did not react to her tone. He just looked back down at the documents for a second, then up again, steady, measured. This is not a technicality, he said, and there was no room in that sentence for interpretation. This is a property matter, and that shift, small as it sounded, changed the entire direction of the conversation. Brenda's lips pressed together, a quick inhale through her nose like she was recalculating in real time. So what are you saying? She asked, trying to pull control back into a question she could steer, that he can just shut it off whenever he wants and leave families without water. And there was the angle again, not ownership, not legality, but optics, pressure, the idea that if she framed it as harm, it would outweigh the facts sitting on the hood of that patrol car. I did not answer right away, because I had learned a long time ago that timing matters just as much as truth. And instead I reached back into the fold of papers and pulled out one last item. Smaller, laminated at the edges from years of being handled, a permit issued long before her development ever existed, stamped with a date that did not care about her timeline or her authority. I placed it next to the others, letting it sit there for a second before speaking. This system was permitted for agricultural use with full control retained by the property owner, I said, keeping my voice even. That includes operation, maintenance, and access. And I tapped the line that spelled it out in language that did not bend. Reed leaned in again, reading it, and I could see the moment it connected, not just the words, but the structure behind them. The fact that this was not a shared utility that had drifted into dispute. It was a private system that had been used without permission and then treated like it was public because nobody had stopped it sooner. Brenda shook her head slightly, a reflex more than a rebuttal. That is outdated, she said, but there was no weight behind it. Now, no documentation to follow, no binder page to flip to that could support what she was saying. Reed straightened, looking from the permit to her, then to me, and the neutrality that had been there when he stepped out of the car was gone, replaced by something clearer, something grounded in the same kind of certainty my father used to carry when he stood over that valve and knew exactly what it controlled. "Ma'am," he said, voice calm but final in a way that did not invite argument. "He is within his rights to control access to a privately owned system." And the words settled into the space between us like the last piece of a mechanism clicking into place. Brenda did not speak right away, and in that silence, with the patrol car idling and the dry line stretching out past the fence toward a neighborhood that suddenly felt a lot farther away, I knew the moment had shifted from accusation to consequence. And there was no version of it where she could simply talk her way back to where she had started. For a moment, nobody moved, and the only thing still working in that entire system was the quiet tick of cooling metal behind me and the low idle of the patrol car, steady, patient, like it had seen this kind of shift before. Brenda's eyes flicked from the permit to Reed, then back to me, and I could see the calculation happening. Fast now, not about whether she was right, but about how much of this had already slipped out of her control. "So that is it," she said, voice tighter, trying to hold on to something that sounded like authority. "He shuts it off, and we are just supposed to accept that." And this time Reed did not hesitate, did not leave space for interpretation. "What I am saying is that this is a civil matter tied to private property," he replied, and the words were clean, direct, not raised, not softened, just placed exactly where they belonged. The two neighbors down by the road shifted their weight, one of them crossing his arms, the other glancing back toward the line of houses as if the distance between here and there had suddenly grown longer than it looked on a map. Brenda let out a short breath through her nose, turning slightly away from the hood, and for the first time since she arrived, she was not performing for an audience. She was reacting to a reality she could not rewrite. "We will be taking this up with the county," she said, and it sounded less like a threat and more like something she was telling herself, a direction to move now that this one had closed. I nodded once, not in agreement, not in challenge, just acknowledging the only path left that actually followed the rules she had been ignoring. "That is where it should have started," I said, and I kept my voice level, because there was no point adding weight to something that was already settled. Reed gathered the papers carefully, not folding them, just aligning the edges before handing them back to me. The gesture small but deliberate, like returning something to the person it belonged to. "I would recommend keeping those accessible," he said, and there was a quiet understanding in that this was not the last time someone might try to argue around what was written. I took them back, the paper warm from the sun and the contact with the car hood, and slid them into the fold, feeling the familiar thickness settle against my palm. Brenda stepped back toward her car then, each movement a little more measured, the sharp edges of her earlier confidence worn down by something she could not talk over or call away. And when she reached for the door handle, she paused just long enough to look back at the line running along the fence, that strip of ground she had treated like an extension of her control for months. The wind moved through again, lifting a bit of dust, carrying it across the boundary that had been there the entire time, whether she acknowledged it or not. And in that moment, the difference between standing near something and owning it felt as clear as the line drawn on that map. Reed gave a small nod in my direction, nothing formal, just recognition that the situation had resolved itself without needing anything more from him, then turned back toward his vehicle. The engine note shifted slightly as he prepared to leave, and the sound of it rolling back down the road felt different than when it arrived, lighter somehow, like the pressure that had been building all afternoon had finally found somewhere to go. I stood there a second longer, watching the dust settle back into place, the fence line steady, the pump house quiet, everything exactly where it had always been, just seen a little more clearly now. The sun had started to drop just enough to take the sharp edge off the heat, and the shadows stretched longer across the dirt as the sound of the patrol car faded into the distance. leaving behind a kind of quiet that felt earned, not empty. I stood there for a minute, listening, letting the stillness settle back into place the way it always did after something passed through and tried to rearrange it. And then I turned and walked back toward the pump house, boots pressing into the same ground. My father had walked 1,000 times before me. The metal door creaked as I pushed it open, that familiar sound echoing inside the small space. And the air carried that mix of oil, dust, and warm steel that never really leaves, no matter how many seasons roll through. The valve sat where it always had, solid, simple, not interested in opinions or arguments, just pressure and control, open or closed, nothing in between. I rested my hand on the wheel again, feeling the heat still trapped in it from the afternoon sun, and for a second I just stood there, thinking about how something this basic could turn into something so complicated the moment someone decided it should belong to them without ever asking. Outside, beyond the fence line, I could see the rooftops catching the last of the light, identical angles, identical spacing, a whole system built on the idea of order, but missing the one thing that actually mattered, permission. I turned the valve slowly, steady, the way I had been taught, not forcing it, just guiding it back into motion, and the pipes responded the way they always did, a low vibration at first, then a deeper hum as the water pushed through, reclaiming the path it had always followed. The sound moved outward, along the line, under the fence, across that invisible boundary that had caused all of this. And for a moment it felt almost ironic that something so quiet could carry so much weight. I stepped back, wiping my hands on my jeans, and listened as the system came fully alive again. Not because anyone demanded it, not because of pressure or threats or calls to authority, but because it was my choice to turn it back on. The wind picked up just enough to move through the grass, brushing against the side of the pump house, and I caught that same dry scent that had been there earlier, only now it felt different, like the tension had been pulled out of it. I walked back toward the gate, resting my arm on the top rail for a second, looking out across the line where everything had played out, and there was no mark left of it, no sign that anything had happened except the memory of it sitting somewhere behind my eyes. That was the thing about this kind of situation, it never looked dramatic once it was over, no big moment, no loud ending, just a shift back to how things were supposed to be all along. Brenda would go back to her meetings, her rules, her version of order, but now there was a line she could not pretend not to see, a boundary backed by more than words. Something recorded, measured, and enforced without raising a voice. I pushed off the gate and turned back toward the house, the sound of water steady behind me, consistent, reliable, exactly the way it was meant to be. And as the last light dipped lower across the land, it hit me that nothing I had done that day was about winning anything. It was just about making sure that what was mine stayed exactly that, not louder, not bigger, just clear, the way it should have been from the start.